This is KM Wyland, and you are listening to the 513th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. This episode of Helping Writers Become Authors is brought to you in partnership with Podtone. If you're a podcaster who's struggling or unsure about your recording quality, or if you need help editing, mixing, or mastering your podcast, you can visit the team who works with me every week at podtone.com or drop them an email at info@podtone.com to get started today. And speaking of Podtone, I teased a few, months ago now, that I was on the verge of upgrading to a new recording system with a new mic. But with all the upheaval from the pandemic this spring and summer, that got kind of delayed. But as I hope you can already hear, I'm excited that with this episode, I'm officially up and running with my new setup and definitely feeling the most professional I've ever felt in my podcast career so far. So Hayden Samick of Podtone gets huge thanks from me for that, for guiding me to the right equipment and for spending quite a bit of time helping me get set up. Anyway, with all that said, I hope you particularly enjoy this week's episode, 7 Misconceptions About Being a Writer. Like any good story, the writing life is a tale of deceptive depth. At first glance, it offers up a shiny, artsy, fun cover. Become a writer, its title beckons, and its first chapters lure us in by fulfilling all these initial promises. But the deeper we get, the further we go, the more we realize there's more to this story than meets the eye. There's more adventure, more conflict, more drama, and more comedy than we could ever have realized. In short, there are many different misconceptions about being a writer. At the beginning of the year, I started rereading my old journals, starting from when I was 14, because at some point I got embarrassed and burnt everything prior to that. It's been fascinating to revisit my young self for many reasons, but one of the most interesting is remembering what it was like to be that young writer just starting out, the one who didn't even know they made books that taught you how to write. I'd all but forgotten what it was like at the beginning of the journey to be on the very first page of my own personalized version of Become a Writer. Certainly for me so far, the adventure has been full of surprises. And since I'm now 20 years into this journey and long since complacent with many of the challenges that initially seemed insurmountable, it's both startling and delightful to realize the story of being a writer is far from formulaic. Today, I thought it might be fun to take a look at 7 of the misconceptions about being a writer that I used to believe, some of them for many, many years. Many of them were useful in their time and place, if only because they narrowed my options in the beginning and kept me from being overwhelmed by too many options. But each was also a joy to conquer on the way to seeing a much bigger vista on the other side. So here they are. Misconception number 1. Writing doesn't count until you're a quote-unquote real writer. This has got to be the most prevalent of all misconceptions about being a writer. And in all fairness, the title of this podcast and my website certainly hasn't done anything to help. It begins, of course, with the reality that we start as beginners with a long road before us if we are ever to be published, prolific, or even simply professional. But the idea that our writing doesn't count until we are published, prolific, and professional is simply untrue. People often ask me what qualifies them as a real writer. Publication is the clearest metric, but as my young self learned, that's not always so clear either. I started out right on the cusp of the indie boom back when no one had anything good to say about self-publishing, and not without good reason. So I walked a long and winding road on the way to figuring out what qualified me as a real writer. Was it my first self-published novel? Was it when I gained a certain number of sales, followers, hits, rankings? I'm honestly not sure where I crossed the line and decided I was a real writer. Looking back, I rather think there was no line. There was just the passage of time and the gaining of experience. I have always disliked the phrase aspiring writer, or worse, wannabe writer. Rather, pre-published writer is one of my favorite ways to talk about the launch pad phase. If you write, you are a writer. And if you are a writer, then you are already a real writer. Don't discount what you write in the early days. And please don't burn it like I did. You're no less a real writer in the beginning than you were a real person in childhood. Misconception number 2. There's a magic daily word count that proves you're disciplined. It's kind of funny, actually. The writing life is deeply non-normative. It's different for each of us. And yet writers suffer deeply from comparativitis. Largely, I think this is because the sheer vastness of the creative life puts all of us at sea, and we look to our fellows to help us understand what might be normal and what might not. Certainly there is value in this. Long ago, I remember reading Elizabeth George's book Right Away and finding great comfort in her approach to planning a story because it grounded my own instinctive approach. But I'm quite sure other young writers read the same book and found it horrifying because it didn't fit their own instinctive approaches at all. And so it goes with daily word count, among other things. We're always sneaking looks over our peers' shoulders, wondering just how many words they write every day. Do our own habits measure up? Or are we about to discover how woefully undisciplined we really are? But there's not a secret sauce. There's no magic daily word count. Jay Gunther commented insightfully on last week's post, "Words per day can be a deceptive measure of progress. I believe that every story has its own natural pace of development. Faster is not always better. In fact, it can be dangerous. The writer's mind is not a microwave. It's more like an imu, the pit used to slow cook an entire pig. It takes time for the conscious mind and the unconscious mind to work together to cook up a fully balanced, consistent story. Many writers underestimate the importance of mulling scenes over and brainstorming alternatives before putting words on paper." Some writers write in great swaths of 8 or more hours a day, pounding out tens of thousands of words in a sitting. Others poke out bare sentences at a time. Most of us fall somewhere in between. The proof of our discipline as writers is found far less in how fast the words flow from us, and much more in the fact that we keep showing up and inviting them to flow. Misconception number 3. The rest of your life must never take a back seat to your writing. This is one I believed for a long time. My mantras were treat writing like a job, and if you don't take your writing seriously, no one else will either. And they were good mantras as far as they went. Certainly they helped me hone daily discipline. But if we believe these ideas too stringently, we risk either never looking up from our desks or feeling constantly guilty because other parts of our lives do, in fact, push their way to the front of the line. During this time of global unease, I have heard from writer after writer struggling with compounded stress because they simply can't find it in themselves to write like normal right now. But if this pandemic and its myriad tentacles is teaching us nothing else, I think it's safe to say it's proving that life follows its own cycles. Some days, weeks, months, years are for writing. Some are not. One of the most joyous lessons I have learned so far as a writer is that the non-writing days, weeks, months, years do not mean I'm any less of a writer. They just mean it's time to learn something new, to explore, to refill the tank. Indeed, I'd have to say writing only truly works when the rest of your life is in the front seat. Misconception number 4. The writing life follows a set roadmap. Maybe it's just because I'm so linear-minded, But I entered the writing life with this conception that it was a neatly mapped and well-traveled road. As writers advance down this road, they pass a steady progression of milestones, rather like successive grades in school. Again, to a certain degree, this is true. If nothing else, you start out as a beginner, move on to the intermediate phase, and perhaps someday become advanced. But beyond that progression, which is affected by little more than time, the writing ride is wild and uncharted. My journey so far looks nothing like how I thought it would. I also dare say my journey looks nothing like yours, and yours looks nothing like anyone else's. We come to writing at all ages. We write for all kinds of different reasons. Our journeys to publication, or not, follow many different paths. And even the ebb and flow of our creative interests and motivations are ever shifting. So if there's one thing I would say about the writing life at this point, it's full of plot twists. Misconception number 5. Writers are wiser than everyone else. In a vague sort of way, I used to think of writers as some kind of transcendent version of humanity. How wise they must be, how different from common mortals. I mean, they have their names on book covers in the grocery store, for heaven's sakes. Certainly, those writers whose names are noticed, much less recognized, did have the talent and smarts to get their names on those covers. But at some point, when you realize you are an author, you also realize you haven't somehow become bigger in order to fit the role. Rather, your idea of author becomes quite a bit smaller. You realize that, if anything, being an author is a challenge to learn more because you don't know anywhere near enough. Misconception number 6. Either writing is glamorous or writing is for lazy bums. Nothing stops dinner conversation faster than telling people you're a writer. No one ever seems to know quite what to make of it, very possibly because they've never before gotten that answer to the "so what do you do?" question. Should the conversation happen to progress past polite grunting at this point, you're likely to get one of two responses. Either people geek out and think you must be rich and famous with multiple movie adaptations under your belt, or they inconspicuously break eye contact in the suspicion that you're just covering for the fact that you're too lazy to have a real job. For most of us, writing is neither glamorous nor a breeze. Very few of us live in a mansion or walk the red carpet. It's true, we often do spend long hours lying around in the hammock or on the couch, but usually in some sort of agonized struggle to break through our story woes. On the whole, writers are incredibly disciplined people. They're like bodybuilders of the imagination, always working, always honing, always subjecting themselves to rigorous self-improvement plans. In fact, writers are some of the least lazy people I know. And we do all this even though we have long since been disillusioned in the notions of glamour. Money, fame, and movie adaptations sound fun, but they're not why the majority of us do what we do day in and day out. This quote from Ryan Rudell nails it. Maybe it won't be famous. Maybe it won't be a movie. But that's not why I started it, and that's not why I'll finish. Misconception number 7. Writing is very serious stuff. After my first novel came out, I went to the post office to mail review copies. I told the postal worker it was my first book, and he drawled, "What is it, a cheap romance?" I was mortified, and I rattled off something about how, no, it was a historical novel about duty and justice. And it took me a long time after that to admit that what I write is genre pulpiness full of swash, and yes, a good dose of romance. But it wasn't just the deprecating sexism of the postal worker's comment that made me reluctant to name what I write as fun stories. It was also the belief that writing, if it's to be any good, should be very serious stuff. And certainly writing is serious. It shapes our world, even if no one reads it but ourselves. it still shapes our lives. But if writing our stories is a great responsibility, it is no greater a responsibility than is every other word we put into the world. And a lot of those words are just good fun. Indeed, I adamantly believe some of the most powerful stories, for both good and evil, are those that are most entertaining. So these days, if someone asks me about one of my books, I usually jump to the most fun part first. In truth, I began to realize misconceptions about being a writer are never ending. But I'm also realizing that the more lightly we camp on certain ideas as gospel, the more easily we're able to discard them when they're no longer of use to us. 20 years from now, I look forward to reading my current journal and smiling back at the things I used to believe, but have long since outgrown. So I hope you'll share your experience with this. What are some misconceptions about being a writer that you used to hold but have grown past? If you'd like to be part of the word player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to support helping writers become authors, I would totally appreciate it if you'd consider taking the time to leave a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.